Okay, welcome to Gettysburg Historic Walking Tours, and I am Frank P. Marone Jr., your historian. We are looking here at Christ Evangelical Lutheran Church, which is the oldest structure in Gettysburg that's continuously used as a church. It was founded in 1835 to be the English-speaking Lutheran church in Gettysburg, for St. James Lutheran, which was in existence since 1789, conducted its services in German. It was also to be the primary assembly hall for the Lutheran Theological Seminary and for Pennsylvania, which is known today as Gettysburg College. It was always referred to as the College Church and hosted numerous graduation ceremonies and other meetings for the college and seminary. The structure was one of the first hospitals established during the Battle of Gettysburg, and at its peak accommodated approximately 150 wounded soldiers. The cupola on Christ Lutheran is a smaller version of the cupola at the Lutheran Theological Seminary building. Like the latter cupola, the Christ Lutheran cupola has 8 sides, but this cupola was here in 1863, as opposed to the cupola at the seminary building, which burned in 1913. Another difference between the two cupolas is that the Christ Lutheran cupola houses this approximately 600-pound bronze bell. The bell was cast in 1788 for a Spanish or Portuguese convent and has been in the Christ Lutheran cupola since 1836. At one time, there were 2 linden trees in front of the Christ Lutheran Church were witnesses to the Battle of Gettysburg, and they were probably planted around 1835. Linden trees are also known or called bee trees. Now, on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, on July 1st, 1863, Confederate forces engaged Union troops west of town near the Lutheran Seminary. Medical personnel of the First Corps selected the College Lutheran Church at 44 Chambersburg Street as a divisional field hospital. A civilian resident of Gettysburg recalled that 140 men were laid in the sanctuary around midday, beds being improvised by laying boards on top of the pews. Limbs were being amputated and thrown out of the church windows, piling up on the ground below. Late in the afternoon, the Confederates began to push Union troops through the town of Gettysburg. Shortly after 4 o'clock, the overwhelmed First Corps soldiers fell back through the streets of Gettysburg to the heights on Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill, south of town. Chaos ensued as jubilant Confederates followed closely on their heels. As the Union retreat swept toward the College Lutheran Church, Chaplain Horatio Stockton Howe of the 90th Pennsylvania was assisting members of the medical staff inside the building. After hearing shots outside, Howe turned to a nearby surgeon and said, "I will step out for a moment and see what the trouble is." Sergeant Archibald Snow followed Howe out the church door. Later, Snow wrote the most detailed account of what happened. "I had just had my wound dressed and was leaving through the front door just behind Chaplain Howe. At the same time, when the advanced skirmishers of the Confederates were coming up the street on a run. Howe, in addition to his shoulder straps and uniform, wore the straight dress sword prescribed in the Army regulations for chaplains. The first skirmisher arrived at the front of the church steps just as the chaplain and I came out. Placing one foot on the first step of the soldier, called on the chaplain to surrender. But Howe, instead of throwing up his hands promptly and uttering the usual 'I surrender,' attempted some dignified explanation to the effect that he was a non-combatant and such was exempt from capture. At that time, a shot from the skirmisher's rifle ended the controversy. The man who fired the shot stood on the exact spot where the memorial tablet has since been erected, and Chaplain Howe fell upon the landing at the top of the steps." Now, there are a few different versions of Howe's death. All versions agree that he was visiting the church, which was being used as a hospital on July 1st, 1863. All versions agree that he was shot as the Confederates came into town that afternoon. However, one version has Howe shot by a Confederate from Boyer's Corner. That location is near the Diamond, which we know today as Lincoln Square, of then in 1863, which was Boyer's Grocery Store, and today it's a menswear store. The building is on the north side of Chambersburg Street, right at the square, and would be the last building on the right if you were looking from the church. Now that would be quite a shot to hit Hal if he was at the bottom of the steps. If Chaplain Hal was at the top of the steps, it would be an impossible shot from Boyer's Corner. The most likely thing that happened was that Hal emerged from the hospital church from the center door at the top of the steps. A Confederate at the bottom of the steps demanded that Hal surrender his sword, and instead of unbuckling his weapon, he tried to explain to him that he didn't have to surrender it because he was a non-combatant. The Confederate, who had in an interesting time earlier fighting other U.S. soldiers throughout the day, was probably not in a mood to negotiate. He shot and killed Hal while standing at the spot designated by the marker. Hal's body fell at the landing portico at the top of the steps. Now, Christ Lutheran served as a hospital from July 1st, 1863 to August 15th, 1863. Although it was officially a U.S. hospital, it treated both Union and Confederate soldiers. At its peak, it had 78 patients, all Union soldiers. 2 Chambersburg Street women, Nancy Weichert, the widow of Peter Weichert, from the frightened sexton, obtained a key to the church to open the door so it could be used as a hospital. Now here we are up in the bell tower looking toward the west, and we can see a lot of the things that could have been seen on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863 from this position. You can see the seminary out there to the west, and as we pan over to the north side, you can see Oak Hill. Many of the buildings that once stood nearby, like the Eagle Hotel, which would have sat directly across the street from where we are now, looking straight ahead, is no longer there. The Frederick Huber House, or the Henry Huber House, which you can see there right in front of us, was also used as an observation point during the Battle of Gettysburg, especially on July 1st of 1863, as the Confederate attack from the north and the west chased the Union soldiers through the town and back to Gettysburg. You can see the view here of Oak Hill. You can see the college campus there with the cupola. Now, getting up to the bell tower of Christ Lutheran Church is an old winding wooden staircase, much like the cupola in the video I did at Pennsylvania Hall of Gettysburg College. Many people have carved or written their name in the woodwork leading up here. And of course, up here is a beautiful and very old bell that is still used today, rung from the sanctuary of the church itself. Christ Lutheran is one of the more historic churches in town, dating back not only to the entire period of the American Civil War, but also to the Battle of Gettysburg itself. And of course, once you're up in the bell tower cupola, the views are phenomenal. Now, we are now looking east toward the town square. And again, we can zoom in and you can see the buildings of the Catholic Church Seminary, and in the distance, the water tower on East Cemetery Hill. Now, with less trees and less higher buildings in 1863, of course, the fields at Gettysburg would have been very much easy to view from this vantage point. And that is why, no matter whether it's this cupola or the cupola of the Catholic Church or over at the college, generals as well as signal officers did use these particular buildings as vantage points so that they could get a look at what was going on. And as we pan across the town here from the bell tower, you can see the amazing views. Imagine standing here on July 1st, 1863, in this very direction and looking at Union soldiers retreating from the north and west, passing on their way to Cemetery Hill, where they would reform and make the Union fishhook position. So as we scan here from the southeast towards Cemetery Hill back to the north, you can get a perspective of what soldiers from both Union and Confederate Army would have got on July 1st and 2nd, 1863. And then we're going to go back downstairs in front of the church and then across the street to talk about Mary McCallister. Again, this has been a rare look and a view from the top of Christ Lutheran Church, their bell tower, here at the top of the church, probably a good 65 feet in the air. Now, Mary McCallister, who lived across from Christ Church, assisted her. On the first day, Mary McCallister recalled that every pew was full, some sitting, some lying, some leaning on others. She also mentioned that an artillery shell struck the roof of the church on July 1st, 1863. Private Enos B. Vale of the 20th New York State Militia of the 1st Corps stated that some surgeons from other corps would only treat their own men. He stated, "The surgeons were working from the front to the rear of the church, taking each pew in turn. When the surgeon of the 11th Corps reached me, he saw the Corps badge on my cap, passed on, and took the next patient. After a short argument, he consented to treat my case." Another Gettysburg resident, Jenny S. Cross, recalled that 100 men were in the church proper, being improvised by laying boards on top of the pews. On Sunday following the battle, there was a religious service conducted by Dr. Bauer. Though it had lasted a short time, 5 men died. After the battle, help for the wounded arrived from other parts of the country. Mrs. C.A. Elher, a nurse with the Patriotic Daughters of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, wrote that she worked in the church many days assisting with cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the patients. She stated that the menu became tea and toast in the morning with soft-boiled eggs, dinner, chicken or mutton soup, always 2 vegetables, and sometimes a simple pudding. For supper, tea with stewed fruit and buns. It was very simple, but you may form some idea of the amount of labor performed over a blazing wood fire in the middle of July. Although not damaged by much artillery fire, the shot Mary McCallister described as hitting the church on July 1st is the only known artillery incident. Small arms fire destroyed the windows and caused other damage. More importantly, the church was made unattainable by the human waste and other disease conditions resulting from 6 weeks of intense use as a 140-man hospital operating under fairly primitive medical and sanitary conditions. This has been a look at the Christ Lutheran Church here on Chambersburg Street. My name is Frank P. Marone Jr., and I am your tour guide of Gettysburg Historic Walking Tours. We will now take a look at the home across the street in which Mary McCallister lived in during the Battle of Gettysburg. We've already heard a little bit about her story, and we're going to do it more in depth as we take a look at her home. July 1st through the 3rd, 1863 was an unprecedented time in the town of Gettysburg. When we look back these days, we remember the famous generals who led here and the countless soldiers who died. As we look at this house, which Mary McCallister was living in 1863, at the age of 41, Mary was considered a spinster. She lived with her sister Martha and Martha's husband John, and they made their livelihood by running a small general store on Chambersburg Street. When the battle commenced, Mary did what she could to aid and feed the hungry soldiers that were here. While she may have been no hero, there is little denying her bravery. On the first day of the battle, Mary left her home to go across the street and aid the wounded soldiers at Christ Lutheran Church. There, she experienced the grim outcome of battle firsthand. Mary recalled that the church was packed with the wounded as surgeons and doctors went about their business. She said every pew was full with the injured, some sitting, some lying, some leaning on others. They, the surgeons, cut off their limbs and threw them out the window. Mary pressed on in the horror, doing what she could until a shell struck the roof and she got scared. Mary was so frightened by the incident, she ran to her home. Sadly for Mary, she could not escape the war there. The rebels were sending grape shot down the street, and everyone who was on the street had to get in the houses or be killed. And that is the way some of the Union men got into the McCallister house. Most of these Union soldiers did not stay long at Mary's home, as they soon found themselves trapped by Confederates. The injured remained in Mary's house, but the rest were taken away as prisoners. After they left, Mary went into the church again to retrieve a surgeon for the wounded. The surgeon suggested to Mary that she and Martha should hang something red outside the house to indicate that it was a field hospital, so that the rebels would leave them alone. Mary and Martha took his advice, but as they were fastening a red shawl to a broom to hang out the window, they witnessed a rather disturbing scene. Some Confederate soldiers came riding down the street, firing off their guns and yelling. They stopped in front of the church where they exchanged some words with wounded men on the steps. A few minutes later, Mary heard a pistol shot, and she saw a man laying dead on the pavement. She heard the men on the steps say, "Shame, shame." That was a chaplain. And the men on horseback responded that he was going to shoot. But the wounded men retorted by saying he was not armed. A few minutes later, the rebels rode off again, shooting as they had come. That man was the chaplain of the 90th Pennsylvania Volunteers. The second day of the battle was calmer for Mary. She cooked and baked for the wounded, and at one point she left her home to get a few Union officers some liquor that they had requested. She went to a drugstore and made her purchase, but before she left, a shell struck the building, leaving a hole. And the store owner warned her, "You will be killed if you stay." Mary went home and gave the liquor to the officers, whom she assumed would be giving it to injured men. Instead, the men divided the alcohol amongst themselves, and Mary never went out for any more. On the final day of the battle, on July 3rd, 1863, Mary went to her warehouse to retrieve a barrel of molasses she had there. Inside, she discovered some rebels eating it. When Mary told them to stop, they insulted her, and one of them even threatened to shoot her. Mary solved the issue by confronting a rebel officer who made the men leave. He told Mary if she was disturbed again to go to his headquarters and that he would handle it. Mary was never bothered any further. Her story may seem mundane in comparison to other accounts of the battle. What makes her story compelling, however, is that of an ordinary civilian caught in the Battle of Gettysburg. She was trying to live her life amongst the turmoil of war. The citizen story is often overlooked, but Mary's narrative offers us a rare insight into what an ordinary civilian faced when the war came to her doorstep. This has been the Mary McCallister Residence. I am historian Frank P. Marone Jr. of Gettysburg Historic Walking Tours.